be frightened of saying the wrong thing, maybe getting someone into trouble, maybe there was still a fear of communism returning. So it was only, I think in that sense we exploited a fairly narrow window of opportunity. We worked between 2003 and 2006. This was a time when people, 10 years later, the moral status of Memorial had increased among these people. They got older, they wanted to get this thing off their chest before they passed away. They wanted their grandchildren to know their story. They were more willing to come forward and talk about really quite intimate things. The book handles very, very intimate stories. Moscow Memorial inherited this photograph. I never lecture with notes, so I need pictures to remind me what I'm going to say next. And in a sense, this gets us to the heart of what I wanted to understand, I think. You'll probably realise what's happened in this picture. We don't know who it is. In the early 1990s, Moscow Memorial was simply inundated with people coming in, handing over archives, family archives. And this was part of that torrent of material. We know the tomb of the unknown soldier. This is the photograph of the unknown family. It must have been taken shortly after the return of the soldier in the middle, who has a badge of Lenin, one of the highest orders. But then, presumably, at some stage in the next few years, was arrested, and so with a permanent pencil, his face was erased. You've probably seen such pictures from political life. There are lots of commissars who vanished. This is a practice that also took place in families, to show that this was no longer a member of the family. We had interviews with one family, I recall, Trubina, not Trubina, I forget the name of the Turkina from Perm. And this precise thing happened. She said that her father was arrested as a Trotskyist in 1937, and that her grandmother, her father's mother-in-law, had said, well, we don't have enemies in our family, and she simply erased his picture. And the daughter was told never to mention his name again. So this did happen, but how does that affect, how does that affect the daughters? How does that affect the family relations? I started on the project in 2002 after I finished Natasha's Dance, and basically at that stage I had no money, I had no grant. So I went back to all those families I'd known in the 1980s, and through their friends I started going around Moscow and Petersburg mainly, interviewing people and desperately asking if they might, trust me enough to let me read their family letters or whatever. And in this way I collected about 20 families, I think. And then I came across a man called Sasha Kozyrov in Petersburg, and I took his story, which was an amazing story. It didn't go into the book though, but he rang me one evening and said, Orlando, what you're doing is really interesting, and I've been telling my friends about it. And they're very keen also to tell you their stories, but they want me to interview them for you. So I said, sounds good, Sasha. How many families are you thinking of? And he said, well, I've made a list, and so far I have 186 people on it. So that's how it worked to begin with, just by word of mouth, people wanting to come forward. It wasn't very scientific, but I had no other option, and I had a sense of urgency because I guess the average age of the people we were interviewing was 78, 80, something like that. And then in 2003 I got 2 grants from British academic institutions, and they enabled me to enter into this contract with Memorial, which had been doing oral history since the late 1980s. And I picked 3, Memorial is across Russia, but some more active than others. And I picked 3 centres who would themselves then go out to smaller towns and villages and on separate projects to give a broader spread. And these centres were Moscow, Petersburg and Perm, which had the strongest traditions of oral history. And we got a sort of database of people who were prepared to come forward from their membership. Yeah, we got a database, and from those I then selected about 400 families to be interviewed. Some people say, I remember the American historian of Soviet Union, Shirley Fitzpatrick, saying to me, oh well, Orlando, if you work with Memorial, you'll get a certain story, a certain point of view, as if victims of repression were some sort of minority. In the 1990s, when Memorial expanded, there was recognition of victims of oppression, more so than there is today. And people from all walks of life joined Memorial. So among the people we had giving us interviews were the children and families of, for example, senior Bolsheviks, senior members of the NKVD. We even had the families of 3 Gulag commanders, camp commanders. But I also reject the notion that to work with the Memorial is to give you a minority viewpoint, in the sense that, let's think about it. Were their families untouched by repression? We know from the KGB archives there were 35 million sentences to the Gulag between 1928 and 1953. Of course, 35 million sentences does not mean 35 million people. Many people got several sentences. Most historians would agree that something in the region of 10 million is a reasonable estimate. If you add then victims of Kulak repression, the million-odd people executed in 1937 to 8, and members of nationalities deported by Stalin as victims of repression, you get something in the region of 25 million people.